Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you are all having a wonderful weekend. Today is Sunday, July 19th. Now, I want to let you guys know up front that this might be a little bit of a different episode, a little bit of a shorter episode. Things are kind of hectic around here for me. I'm currently moving out of one apartment, moving into a different apartment. So I still wanted to get this episode out, and I kind of wanted to do something a little bit different, a little bit fun, to kind of liven the spirit around, because, you know, moving can be a little bit difficult, a little bit tedious. So I wanted to have some fun, do something a little bit different, and so this week we're going to be talking about one film series, one trilogy, that spans many, many years, and that is the Before Trilogy. It's a series that I've been wanting to talk about for a hot minute, since I watched it at the very beginning of quarantine. And so this episode might be a little bit shorter because it's a series, so a lot of the positives and negatives from one movie may carry over to the next, and I also watched it at the beginning of quarantine, so some of the elements are not as fresh in my head. But regardless, I really wanted to talk about this movie. I still have a lot to say about it, and the films are as follows. We're going to start with Before Sunrise. And then secondly, Before Sunset. And then finally, we'll talk about Before Midnight. And for the final segment, one that will probably be a little bit shorter because things will be sprinkled in throughout. And that's just going to be the making of the Before Trilogy and some facts about the series in general. So I really love these movies. You can know that going in. I think they're great, but I have a lot to say about them. And I just wanted to have a fun episode, so that was a little bit different this week. So let's get into it. Alright, so the Before Trilogy, Before Sunrise, is the first film that I'm going to be talking about. It's the first of the series. It came out in 1995. It follows two people who meet on a train passing through Vienna. One is an American named Jesse, played by Ethan Hawke, who is traveling to Vienna to take a flight to then go back to the United States. And the second is a woman named Celine, played by Julie Delpy, who is traveling through Vienna to get back home to France. They meet on the train and decide to spend one night together in Vienna, and romance ensues. I spoke at length a couple weeks ago about how much I love the romance genre, the romantic comedy maybe, but just love films in general, and this one absolutely blew me away. I had heard a lot about it. I didn't know a lot about it. And I had pretty high expectations, but I didn't know what to expect, if that makes sense. I know that there's a pretty well-established romance film among moviegoers, movie lovers. A lot of people love this film, and I came out on the other end definitely being a part of it. So I'll talk about why this film is so good and why it's so different from a lot of other romance films. I will say up front, if you haven't seen this series, please go watch it. It is excellent. I think I watched all of these on Amazon, so it might be $3 or $4 per movie, but more than worth it. And I do want to say that I won't be spoiling these films, other than maybe some minor plot details here and there, but it is a series that follows chronologically, so where one movie starts is probably where the last movie ended, or at least event-wise you may know what's going on and what happened at the end of certain movies. So if you don't want to know any of that, I would recommend watching the series first and then coming back to listen to this, but just to let you know, all of these films have been out for a little bit, so I knew the plot of all three of them before going into the first. So it doesn't take away from it doesn't spoil anything, but if you really want to go in blind, I would recommend watching it first, because I will be talking a little bit about some of the plot details. But let's start with Before Sunrise. This, I have to say, a little spoiler for my review, not for the movie. So a little bit of a spoiler for me is that this is my favorite of the bunch. It is beautiful. It is so romantic. I'm going to just use synonyms of beautiful, gorgeous, extravagant. It's also just a fun, relatively light movie, but still has some weight to it, has some seriousness to it, which I really like, especially for a romantic movie. You get that there's at least some stakes or some inner depth to these characters, and these characters are by far what you latch onto the most. So the film starts with Celine and Jesse, the two main characters, not next to each other, not interacting to each other on the train, and another couple, a German couple, gets into a fight kind of at the front of the train, and Celine has to move location, so she is right across from Jesse, and Jesse asks her if she speaks German, and they don't really know what they're fighting about, but then they get to talking. They go to the cafe car, the coffee car. No, not really the coffee car. I guess it's like a dinner, like a cafe car. No, okay. I was thinking of like cafe as in French, coffee, which I think is how you say coffee in French. I took French long enough. I should know this. But, so they go, have a drink together in the car, and Celine has no intention of getting out at Vienna, but they hit it off so well that Jesse asks her to spend the night with him. So they can go around the city, although they don't know each other that well. He has one night. And that's actually the thing that I was most nervous about, is because I was waiting for I wanted this kind of like love epic. And I was like, well, how can that happen over the course of one night? And it does. Oh my gosh. They experience an entire relationship basically in one night. And in terms of the film, they experience that relationship, because the highs and lows that you might experience in a romantic film, you get all of that, even though they may have just met and are only spending the first night together. So let's start from a more technical place. Let's start with the screenplay. So the screenplay is, I want to say that the screenplay is one of the best parts of the film, because I think the acting and the characters are extremely important, but the characters are a part of that screenplay. And so the screenplay is phenomenal. Everything is so meticulously written. It all feels very, very natural for something that is so heavily written. So a lot of the actors actually got the chance to, or both the actors, sorry, Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, got the chance to amend the script before actually filming. So it feels very natural to them and how they would speak. And so a lot of the things move, in terms of a conversation, move very naturally. I think if you look at film dialogue, a lot of times there is a weird gap between film dialogue and actual dialogue. So there are things that work well on film that may not be as accurate in real life, but it still feels like real life, because that's just how the language of film goes. It tends to work. This one actually feels like real conversation. The topics flow very sporadically. It'll go from really light to really heavy very quickly. And the characters actually feel like they're actively listening to each other. So the conversation is responding to the other person, but they also kind of have their own agendas going on. So sometimes it's really specifically responding. Sometimes it's kind of weaving their own thing in, which is kind of how conversation works. So it feels extremely natural, works really, really well. And I also like that as far as characters go, this is focused kind of, I think screenplay, acting, and production design, which are usually the first three things I talk about, are all kind of woven together, because every facet of this film works in tandem with each other. Like, they all work. Nothing is like good separately, if that makes sense. Everything is good because it works so well with the other aspects of the film. So like, take for example, this is both a credit to the screenplay and the production design. The atmosphere of the film is extremely dreamlike. So both these characters are in their 20s, so they're having kind of this whirlwind romance with this innocence, optimism, potential naivety of young love. And so the location feels very dreamlike, having it take place in Vienna. European city, a very beautiful historic European city. And so the dreamlike location adds to the dreamlike romance, and it also creates a lot of the conversation, or at least influences a lot of the conversation. So things that they're doing, things that they're thinking, and things that they're kind of experiencing throughout Vienna find themselves woven into the language and to the dialogue that they're speaking. So it feels like the city is an active participant in the film and not just a backdrop. It's like they are actually experiencing it. And so it's nice that their dialogue is influenced by Vienna, because it not only makes for a more natural, more compelling location, but it also adds to the dreamlike quality of both the writing and the location, because they just work so well together. It also is really nice that the dialogue flows so naturally, because this is more or less a real-time movie. So it's one night, and so you get the chance to hear a lot of the characters' conversations, and the conversations that you do get to hear play out with very minimal, if any, cuts, long takes, lots and lots of dialogue, and because it takes place in real time and the dialogue feels so natural, it really feels like a real romance. And that also feeds into the acting and the characters, because it's unbelievable to me that Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy aren't married. Like, the chemistry is, maybe this is a hot take, I think the chemistry between Jesse and Celine is probably the best, if not one of the best chemistry between two characters in a film. Romantic, platonic, otherwise, like, they fit so naturally together, and you feel like they actually understand each other's cadences, and again, are actively listening to each other and really care about what each other's saying. So very early on is when you're rooting for a romance. And then when you finally get a little taste of it, a little glimpse of the romantic side, you are elated, because that's how natural they work together and how well they work together. So you've really just been waiting for it the whole time, and that's a credit to the chemistry and the acting that they've built together. And what's really nice too is that there are these pretty long-winded philosophical lines that, when reading the script, I read like kind of excerpts of it afterwards because I was just kind of so obsessed with it, that feel very pretentious or seem like they could be spoken in a way that would come off very narcissistic or very pretentious. But both the characters have these types of lines, and they say them so naturally and so honestly that you really feel like they believe it, and that it's just somewhat candid. I think when you talk to people in just a one-on-one conversation, getting to know somebody, you get the chance to speak more candidly, or you think that they're speaking more candidly. It's not something that is open for judgment for a large crowd. And so finding a way to actually put that into this film that is for a large crowd works really naturally and is really, really beautiful to see. So I talked a little bit about the production's design with the choice of Vienna and some of the locations that they have. But the other thing that I'll say is that this I won't necessarily say when things go across the board, because I'll reference them when I talk about the next movies, but this one for sure, the lighting is gorgeous. They get to have a lot of different lighting because it starts during the day and ends the next day. So you get golden hour with the sunset. They go to a carnival, and so you get a lot of cool neon lights, and things are really well lit when things are dark. So there's a lot of scenes that take place at night because they spend most of the night together talking, walking throughout the city. So there's a lot of scenes where it's pretty dark, and all of them are lit really well, which is hard when they're walking and there's no cuts. So I think the lighting is both very functional and still very beautiful in terms of the film itself. And then moving on to the cinematography, it's very cool to see a romantic film that is relatively objective between two of the characters. Usually it's told in the perspective of one of the characters. So I had talked about last week, 500 Days of Summer. That's told pretty clearly from Tom's perspective. This one, you get a sense that both characters are getting portrayed in the most objective light that they can, and that kind of comes with the cinematography. So a lot of things are shot in wide shots or two shots, so you actually get both of the characters in the shot itself. And they're also very long takes most of the time. So it's conversations that will last 13, 15 minutes. I think basically there's like 6 or 7, maybe 8 like real scenes in this movie, because they all are kind of about 15 minutes long. It's a pretty short movie. But still, that's kind of hard to hold your attention for that long when you're only talking, particularly if it's one shot with no cuts. And so the fact that you get this holistic, objective reality of both the characters, and the dialogue is so compelling that you can actually have the cinematography complement that by really showing the two characters together and like experiencing each other. Because a lot of times you cut away from somebody listening and you actually get to see both characters listening, which I really liked. And I think a lot of the wide shots and the two shots also emphasize how these characters exist in the space that they're in. So how close they are to each other is really important, obviously, for the story, but also where they exist and how they exist in Vienna, who is basically another character in this story, is really important. And you get the sense of this grandiose space, both between the characters and the characters' relationship to the environment, which I really liked. There's very little editing in this film. I had heard interviews with Richard Linklater, who had said this particularly for Before Sunset, which I'll talk about in just a second, but there is not a lot of editing. There's very, very few cuts. So things were very well rehearsed, lots and lots of rehearsal, lots of edits pre-production, but in post-production there are very few edits, which really gives every scene the room to breathe and the room to where the audience gets the room to actually experience these characters in the same way that they're experiencing each other. So it's really nice that there are no cuts. And then when there are cuts, those cuts feel very intentional. So no cut is wasted, which I think is really nice, because sometimes people will or films will cut on things that maybe don't need to, and you want to see more of. So when there is a cut, because there's so few of them, you really get the weight and gravity of what that cut means, and what we're seeing is what we're supposed to be seeing and what's most important to be seeing. So those cuts feel very intentional, which I like a lot. Much like the rest of the film, the sound is very natural. You get a lot of natural sound effects through the people and the environments that they're in. But what's really cool is that you start to not notice those sounds. You start to drown them out because you're so focused on the conversation and how well these characters know each other after so little time, and how much they're willing to share to the other person. So you're so focused on the dialogue that natural sound kind of gets drowned out. But it's important to have that natural sound, because otherwise it would feel so empty. So you get that sense of space, both with the sound and the cinematography. And I'll talk about the directing, I think, in the Before Sunset review, because the directing is fairly similar through a lot of it, but there are also very specific things about Sunset that I want to talk about. So this film, but just know that the directing is all of the things that I said is because of Richard Linklater, because of the directing, and all of it fits so well together because of his competence in just making a naturalistic film. So I absolutely adore this movie. It is quickly climbing both my favorite films and my favorite romantic films. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's one of those things that I pick as one of my favorite romantic, maybe my favorite romantic movie in a little bit of time, because I'm relatively young, and I think the innocence and optimism of these characters I really related to and I really liked, and it's really beautiful. So I love this film. This film is a solid 10 out of 10. Please go watch it. And if you do decide to go watch it, you got to watch the next two. And that's what we're going to talk about. So keep listening. We're going to talk about Before Sunset, Before Midnight, and then the making of the Before Trilogy. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of Before Sunrise, and I will delve into the rest of the Before Trilogy by talking about the Before Sunset, Before Midnight, and then just the making of the series as a whole. So right now we're talking about Before Sunset, and I will say that if you want no spoilers for the rest of these next two films, please back away now, because the premise of Before Sunset somewhat spoils the ending of Before Sunrise, like a little bit. It wouldn't ruin it. I knew the plot of it, so pretty minor, but it's just narrative spoilers that you might not want. Because actually, a very cool thing about the Before Trilogy, something that is extremely original, is that this one was 9 years later. All the films take place in real time with these characters, and so each film is made 9 years later, and we meet the characters 9 years later, which is awesome. So that first film was 1995, and this one is 2004, not the 1900s. So at the end of Before Sunrise, we see these characters parting ways because obviously one has to get back to France and one has to get back to the US, but they make a pact to meet each other again at the same train station at the same spot, gate, 6 months later. Exactly 6 months later. So the film ends with us not knowing whether they get back together, and in 2004, we pick up to see what has happened. And so in this film, Jesse is now a relatively accomplished author. He is going on a European book tour and has now stopped in France. We then find out that the book is somewhat inspired by his night with Celine, and that they didn't meet each other 6 months later and have not actually seen each other since. But Celine goes to the book showing, to the book reading, and they then spark up conversation and meet again as old friends in Paris, in France, before sunset, before he has to go back to the United States. So this film, the movie was never actually intended to have a sequel upon getting made in 1995. You'd think that if there was a sequel planned, they would want to get that out relatively quickly. And what's nice is that there's kind of a trend nowadays with sequels for films that are much older. And a lot of times they feel like cheap cash grabs. So a lot of times there are films from the 80s, maybe even the 90s, getting a new reboot or a sequel because the studio knows that they can get some money off a known franchise. But what's really cool about this one is that there's a real reason for it to be made so much later. And it's a sequel that Richard Linklater, Julie Delpy, and Ethan Hawke all really wanted to make. Richard Linklater explained it as about 5 or 6 years after Before Sunrise, the characters kind of popped back up into all of their heads, and it feels like such a real depiction of romance in their 20s. What would that be like in their 30s? How does that change? What does that look like? And so it's a very fascinating way to go with these characters, and it's really cool to see how they do it. So I also really love this film. I think it's pretty much on par with Before Sunrise for me. Maybe a little bit lower. I definitely thought it was a little bit lower in the beginning. Probably just because it's not quite as happy, joyful as Before Sunrise. But so that's just the hopeless romantic in me. But by the end of the film, it is definitely on par. Maybe a tad bit lower, but almost exactly the same. I adore Before Sunset as well. And the structure is a little bit different. So it's kind of fascinating because this film is actually done in real time. So Before Sunrise was done in a heightened version of real time. Obviously, we can't watch a film for 14 hours of them spending a night together, but it is a relatively short amount of time, so we do get to spend a lot of time with these characters, and it feels like real time. This one actually is done in real time. So Jesse gets off of his book reading, and they have to leave. He has to leave within about an hour and a half-ish. And so he talks with Celine that entire time, and they tour around Paris. And so we see the entirety of this conversation. And because we're so well acquainted with these characters from the beginning, and now we get that little bit of a gut punch of them not actually meeting together, and that they haven't seen each other since, a couple that we loved so much watching, we are absolutely screaming for them to be honest with each other. You can kind of tell early on by what they're hinting at in their lives, what they're hinting at post when they had met each other, that they're really not being completely transparent with each other. And that's something that I think comes with time, comes with age, because things just get more complicated. And so maybe somebody that you saw as this idealistic person or romanticized person, or maybe not even really a whole person because you only spent so much time with them, you don't want to ruin that because they probably see you that way too. And you don't want to ruin their view of the happy-go-lucky 20-year-old. And so you actually get the sense that they're trying to be honest with each other, but don't want to come across as like too negative, too pessimistic, and that they don't want to be fully transparent with the other person. But because you know them so well and see the chemistry and know how well they work together, you are begging for them to really be honest with each other. And particularly early on in the conversation, the topics they talk about are a lot broader than Before Sunrise. Before Sunrise, they're talking a lot in either personal terms or hypothetical terms, things that are much more philosophy-based, things about love and life and romance. Love and romance are basically the same thing, but like a lot of these philosophical ideas, whereas in Before Sunset, they have basically a decade more of knowledge and experience, so they're talking about much more real-world events. They're talking about actual events in their life. They have a lot more lived experience to go off of. So the topics they talk about are a lot broader, and a lot more diverse. So you get the sense of what somebody in their 30s would talk about versus what somebody in their 20s would talk about, which I think is really fascinating. The other thing that's really nice about the screenplay here, is that much like Before Sunrise, the city complements the dialogue, but in this one, it actually kind of, conflicts with it in a thematic sense, or juxtaposes it in a really fascinating way. So, at least in the cultural context, Vienna is definitely a romantic city. I think any sort of like famous European city can be seen as like a romantic city, romance language. That's something that kind of goes along with it. But Paris is like the city of love. So, even more so than the Vienna, it is a very romantic, love-filled city. And these characters are talking about how love has kind of failed them, or that their perception of love is a lot less optimistic, a lot less happy-go-lucky than it was in their 20s. So they're in a significantly more romantic place. They're with somebody that they have now spent a little bit more time with, which would hopefully lead to something a little bit more romantic than maybe a surface-level exchange. And so it's really fascinating and curious that they're in a even more romantic city, but their views of love are not quite as optimistic as it was in their 20s, which I think was a very intentional thing to be doing here, both with the screenplay and the production design. A little bit of a spoiler that happens about midway through the movie, so I would skip ahead about a minute, 2 minutes if you don't want to hear this, but plot points in this film, like narrative plot points that aren't dialogue based, punch you in the gut. Particularly the one where you find out that Jesse has a family back home is devastating. You're waiting for it, and you're hoping that it doesn't happen, and then it does, and it hits you so hard. So these narrative points, these plot beats, are extremely intentional as to where they're placed, and it moves the story forward in a way that didn't necessarily happen in Before Sunrise. So Before Sunrise feels a lot more, it's still extremely enjoyable to watch, but it feels a little bit more monotonous, maybe a little bit more boring, you can say, because that's kind of how just real conversation works. There's just no real narrative points other than getting to know these characters. The story isn't moving forward because you know that they only have a limited amount of time together. But now we see that there's a future for these characters. And so the plot points are specifically spaced out for you to not know when they're coming and what they are. And when you find out what they are, they can really hurt. They're not as fun. And there's also some definitely in the end of the film that hit you pretty hard. There's also a lot of moments without dialogue that was flirted with, I think, in Before Sunrise, but there are heavier moments in Before Sunset. So in Before Sunrise, there's particularly a moment where they're listening to a record, and they kind of are flirting back and forth with their eyes. And so it's a silent moment with no dialogue, or it's a moment with no dialogue, but it's not a silent moment. We can understand what these characters are going through music. There are some moments without dialogue and some quiet moments in this film that feel like they have the weight of age and responsibility that didn't exist in Before Sunrise. So I thought the lack of dialogue in some scenes was very intentional and very important to have. The acting is, again, similar to Before Sunrise. The characters have amazing chemistry, and the age of the actors parallel with the age of the characters. You really get the sense that they understand these characters and what they may have gone through, and that these lived experiences both for the actors and the characters translate to one another. So the age benefits it. It feels a lot deeper, a lot more mature. But there is still that sense of immaturity that comes with love, where you don't want to expose your whole self because you don't want to get hurt. And so you get that a lot more in this one. And Before Sunrise, they're a lot more vulnerable with each other because maybe they haven't gone through those experiences of hurt in a larger sense, or they don't have as many responsibilities as they might in their 30s. And so they don't want to risk things. They don't want to lose things in their 30s because things are a lot more established and they've gone through a lot more experiences. So you get the weight of the maturity, and then also the immaturity of love in Before Sunset, particularly in the acting. So I talked a little bit about the production design with Paris as a city, but I like in this one too that there was a diversity in lighting in Before Sunrise, but in this one there is very little diversity. So it has to come with the actual cinematography. So the lighting kind of is all at golden hour, which is an excellent choice for a film because that's a great time to shoot a movie. It looks beautiful, and it thematically complements the story. Sun's going down on their relationship, on their time together, maybe, but it's also beautiful and very pretty to look at, pretty to experience. And so the cinematography has a lot more creative camera shots and ones that feel a lot more intimate. Close-ups are used a lot more. You still get those two shots, but there are also some scenes where you see the individual characters and what they might have gone through without the other person, because now they've lived in a world where they've met each other but haven't lived with each other. And so you see some of their internal, kind of those internal cogs moving with the up-close and personal cinematography that's a little bit different than Before Sunrise, sorry. So this one is the film that Richard Linklater had said that there was no editing, virtually. Every scene was used. This film, I think, is only about 70, 80 minutes. And he said that they had only shot like one or two lines of dialogue scenes that they didn't use. And then the scenes that they did use, they don't really cut all that much. So there's very, very little editing. And so that's what makes it feel like real time. But there's I think there's a lot of editing in the script that's important, and a lot of real-time editing. So you get a sense of rising stakes and rising action because there's a time limit. And you're seeing it in real time, so you're really, really aware of the time limit and where it's coming. So the lack of editing benefits the story because we can visualize where the story is heading, and that we don't want it to end. So I think that there's a lot of really clever uses of editing within the lack of editing, if that makes sense. So editing in the story, editing in the characters and the dialogue that doesn't exist in sort of a cinematic context of editing. And then I had mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit more about Richard Linklater in this part of the review. So Richard Linklater really understands characters, and I think he really understands people, and his own experiences translate to how he creates characters and how he directs people. So I really like there's a very clear difference in how he treats and frames these characters in this film than Before Sunrise. And I think that comes with his maturity to grow as a person and as a director. And not that Before Sunrise were mistakes, but he was a different person. He's 10 years older now. So he is creating a film where he understands the characters in context of who they are, or who they are in context of who he is. So I think that he just has a very deep understanding of characters and has all of the cinematic choices be influenced by the strength of his characters, which I absolutely adore. So I think he is a fantastic director and really gets relationships between characters. So I love Before Sunset, almost just as good as Before Sunrise, and there are some beautiful moments in here. So I'm going to give Before Sunset a soft 10 out of 10 as opposed to a solid 10 out of 10. A little bit lower, but it's still a 10 out of 10. It's still amazing. So that's Before Sunset. Stay tuned for the rest of the episode where I close off the Before Trilogy with Before Midnight, and then I'll be talking about some of the making of the Before Trilogy and some trivia on it. But right now we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my reviews of Before Sunrise and Before Sunset. I'll now be capping off the Before Trilogy with my review of Before Midnight, and then for the final segment, I'll be talking about just the making to add some more context to the Before Trilogy, and then some trivia about it. So, Before Midnight is definitely the most different, most unique of the trilogy. It doesn't feel out of place by any means, but is a lot different than Sunrise and Sunset. You can kind of even get that by the name. I mean, there's not really a way you could have gone, I think, with adding sun or Sunrise and Sunset. That's capping it off. You could say like noon, I guess, before high noon. But you get the sense that this one is a little bit different, even from the title. So I'm going to explain the plot, but again, if you don't want to be spoiled, this one, even more so, I think, than Before Sunset, kind of spoils the ending, or Before Sunrise kind of spoils the ending for Before Sunset. So, if you don't want to know anything, it doesn't ruin it. I knew it before going in. I mean, I watched the trailer, so I definitely knew that before going into the movie. It didn't ruin it, but if you want to go in blind, this is your heads up. But the plot of this film is that we meet Celine and Jesse, once again, 9 years later in 2013 on a vacation to Greece, where we now find out that they have started a family together. They have 2 daughters and are not married but together. And they have been together ever since Jesse and Celine met again in Paris that night, or that day of Before Sunset. So they are together, and we are now experiencing them as an older couple, older as a couple. They're not like an older couple. A couple in their 40s. So that's a lot more maturity than their 30s, and especially more than their 20s. So I will say up front, this one is my least favorite of the bunch. Maybe that comes with my hopeless romanticism and maybe naive optimism, but this film is definitely met with a lot less optimism and a lot less hope, which was, I think, kind of a trend of movies, particularly in kind of early 2010s, things maybe were a little bit more cynical, a little more nihilistic, and this definitely plays into that, but it also is different in comparison to the other two films. And I mean, if you look at Before Sunset, it was kind of heading in that route anyway, but that's one of the reasons I don't like it as much. It's also just kind of a much more different film, and I'm going to get into why. So, starting with the screenplay, I said that there was a little less hope and a little less optimism than Before Sunrise and Before Sunset, and maybe that comes with age. I don't know. I hope not. But it also probably comes with just the relationship of these characters actually getting to know each other and maybe aren't trying to like impress each other because they aren't trying to get the other person to swoon over them. They are now comfortable with each other and aren't trying to play anything up for the other person. From a screenplay standpoint, from a script standpoint, there's a lot more intermittent scenes. So Before Sunrise and Before Sunset are both films that pretty much exist as like there are no real scene transitions. There's no scenes in between that don't service the dialogue of the story. So it's just a long conversation followed by another long conversation followed by another long conversation. In this one, they are split up a little bit through editing, through different locations, and through scenes where Celine and Jesse aren't even together. So the scenes where there are long pieces of dialogue, they are still long shots. They are still dialogue heavy. They are mostly reliant on the characters talking to each other, and that's where we get the story beats, where we get to know these characters even more so, and those scenes are still very beautiful, and particularly in this one, they're a lot more heart-wrenching, a lot more heartbreaking maybe than some of the other films. So, moving on to the acting, what I think is really nice about this one is that Before Sunset, they hadn't seen each other in 9 years, and in this one, they've been together for 9 years. So we really get a sense that they have a deep understanding and connection with each other that a lot of times is unsaid. So I had said that there's a lot of intermittent scenes, or a lot more, and even in this one, there are scenes where they're together where things just are not said out loud, which was, again, flirted with in Before Sunset, but in this one is even more so riddled throughout, and I think that comes with the comfort of them being in love and knowing each other, and they don't have to fill the space because they're so comfortable with each other. And in those spaces is where we get to understand how connected these two characters are. So even when it may seem less romantic than the past films and early in the relationship, a lot of it to me felt more romantic because they are so connected to each other and so in tune with the personality and character traits of one another. So I thought that was beautiful, and in a sense, even more romantic than some of this hopeless romantic honeymoon phase type things happening in Sunset and Sunrise. And you also get the sense that they really know each other now. So they're talking about things that are in their shared life and maybe stories that they've heard before. They know the quirks and intricacies of each other, so they're not learning for the first time. They are really comfortable with each other and just really know each other, which we get a sense of in the acting because of, again, how amazing their chemistry is. Oh my God, it's insane. The production design here is very fascinating, I think, because the biggest thing that stood out to me is that compared to Sunrise and Sunset, there are a lot more interiors. So in Sunrise, there are almost none, save for the train and a church, but there's really no scenes where they... I guess there's a bar. So there's a couple. It's like 50-50, maybe. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. But even so, the interiors in those films act in a way to bring the characters closer together. But there are also a lot of scenes where they're outside. And there's a lot of exteriors, which is the case for Sunrise and Sunset. In this one, the interiors are a lot more noticeable. And I just think they're in the film more, and they serve in a way to add sort of a sense of constrictiveness and claustrophobia than the other films, that maybe the relationship isn't as free and as open as they might have wanted to once believe. And I think the interiors kind of hint at where the story might be going, and hint at how these characters are feeling potentially with each other and in the relationship they're in. So I think the use of how many interiors there were is a lot more intentional. There's a lot more people to fill those spaces, because in the first two films, they were pretty much the only characters. They existed to talk to one another. In this one, there are characters that they actually get to talk to, where we see them experiencing the world without one another, which I thought was very fascinating. So we get a sense of who these characters are without their partner, and really understanding who they are and understanding who they want to portray themselves in their relationship. So I liked that aspect, that we get a different understanding of these characters. It's a little bit more diverse in the dialogue. And I think the interiors also complement that. There are also a lot of props, and the sets are a lot more planned out, a lot more going on, a lot more complicated, and again, a lot more claustrophobic, which really complements the story very nicely. And the lighting is also still very dynamic in this. So I keep saying that, but it really is, because we get those interiors. It also takes place in Greece on the water, so we get a lot of blues and whites, which is sometimes difficult to light in a way that isn't too intense, isn't too abrasive. We actually get some soft lighting, and then it also transitions to night, to midnight, in a very natural way, where the colors really fit and things kind of get darker, both in the story and in the lighting, which I think is pretty clever, pretty well done. With the cinematography, one thing that I found extremely fascinating about this one is that, at least on a first watch, in seeing it for the first time, what I noticed is that the camera works in a way to understand the intricacies of their relationship, even more so than the first two films. So a lot of the moments where the camera is closer and more intimate to these characters is when the two share the frame together. And so that adds to the sense of intimacy and sense of connection between the two, that we're really up close and personal, really intimate with these characters when they're next to each other and experiencing the same thing or in the frame together. And then when they're alone is when we get a lot of these wider shots, a lot of full body shots, mid shots that aren't just their face or just their face and torso. It's their full body. We see them, how they exist in the world, and it makes a sense that maybe they're a little bit more alienated, maybe a little bit more alone when they're not with their partner. And I thought that was very curious to see, and really lends itself to the story in a way that is, I think, more specific than Sunrise and Sunset. With the editing, the pacing is a little bit quicker. I touched on that with how there's these intermittent scenes. There's a lot more of these transition scenes. So that just tends to add to the pacing, where it doesn't feel as slow as trudging along. It's also funny how it's the longest film of the series, and it feels the fastest, the quickest. There is, and the pacing also rises in a way that is a little less abrupt than Before Sunset, and a little bit more kind of just natural. It feels like scenes where things get a little bit more intense flow in a way that doesn't feel narratively forced, doesn't feel like it was actually scripted. It feels like that's how that probably would have gone in real life. That feels very natural. So that seems to be the case with a lot of this film, but particularly with the stakes and the emotional stakes in this film, I think that's where it kind of shines through. As far as the sound, much like Sunset and Sunrise, there's a lot of natural sounds, a lot of talking, a lot of dialogue outside of the Jesse and Celine, sound of the ocean, just kind of things going on, which is important to seeing how these characters exist in the space. But I think the score, is a lot more apparent and stands out a lot more in this one. I actually think the fact that the cinematography and the editing and the score feels a lot more intentional is just a move in cinema. This is not across the board, but as far as I can tell, the choice for strong aesthetics and really strong filmmaking choices as opposed to story and characters is something that seems to have shifted pretty drastically Again, not across the board, not trying to stereotype anything as like one way that movies are going, but that just seems to be the case, that aesthetics seem to be a lot stronger, and audiences latch on to that a lot more. And you can kind of see that in the way that this film has moved from 95 to 04 to 2013. And so these choices seem a lot more, maybe not even more intentional, but stronger. And so the score is a lot stronger, a lot more noticeable, and it's a beautiful score. It's somewhat melancholy, which is a mood and tone that kind of seeps through this entire film, and the score makes way for that, for sure. The biggest thing here that's different is, I think, the blocking. A lot of Before Sunrise and Before Sunset have scenes where they kind of just walk around together, and there are definitely blocking choices and choices of how close or how far away the characters should be from each other, but particularly in the penultimate scene of this film, the argument scene, the fight scene in the hotel room, the blocking feels very intentional, very scripted, and you get a sense of what these characters are actually thinking by how close they are or how they're responding to each other as opposed to what they're actually saying. So they're really saying what they want to say through their movements, which I think was very intentional from Richard Linklater's point of view, and the blocking was beautiful here, in the whole film, but particularly in this scene. I think the biggest pet peeve, saddest part for me is that I wish they had gone a different route with these characters. This is a little bit of a spoiler. It doesn't particularly spoil the end because things kind of end somewhat ambiguously, but I would skip to the next segment if you don't want to hear any subjective thoughts based on how the film goes. But in a film series where the characters are so wonderful together, there's so much chemistry, and they really talk about grand topics in a pretty optimistic way. I really wish they had gone a route where that had stayed. I think there's a tendency in film that real love is difficult love, which isn't untrue. Obviously, I think love is something that changes and grows and must be worked on for it to sustain. But there's this sense that prolonged, realistic love is pessimistic and hard to get through and sometimes even unenjoyable, which I don't like. Maybe that's me being young and naive, but I do think that there's a sense of if you really care about somebody, you're willing to grow and change with them and make sacrifices, which is something that the characters don't really make in this film. The characters are fairly selfish. That you get a sense that they're deeply connected to each other and that they do love each other, but they're not necessarily willing to change for each other. So I wish that this idea of realistic love wasn't seeped in pessimism in film, which finds its way into Before Midnight. I would have liked two characters that are seemingly very optimistic and very lovely to be around. I wish that would have sustained. That tonal shift is not something that I really vibed with as much. But that's kind of my only gripe with it. I do think that realistic love can be hard, and this is a realistic love story. It's something that a lot of people can relate to. So I just think that there's a lot of that. A lot of pessimistic, realistic love. So I wish that this one had been sort of a symbol crowning achievement for a happier, more optimistic, but still potentially ambiguous ending. But that's just me. That's me personally. So Before Midnight, for me, gets a soft 8 out of 10. Not nearly as strong as the first two, but still very, very well made, and a really beautiful melancholy film. So, yeah, I mean, I think honestly for me, character-wise, I really like looking at Sunrise and Sunset as a duo, a movie that works in tandem together. But obviously you can't discredit Before Midnight, and a lot of people do love this film and think that it works as a perfect trilogy, which I definitely won't argue with. So that's Before Midnight, and that's the Before Trilogy. Those are my thoughts, but make sure you stay tuned until this next segment where I talk about some of the contextual things around the film, and even some trivia bags. I think that's cool and a fun way to cap off this episode. So stay tuned while we take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around, I have given my reviews of the entire Before Trilogy, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, and Before Midnight. And now this final segment, we get to talk even more about the Before Trilogy with some of the context around the film and some cool trivia about it. So I was absolutely obsessed with Before Sunrise when I started watching it, or when I finished watching it. So I did a lot of research, and there are a lot of cool things around this film. And so we're just going to talk about what the making of this trilogy was like, and why that kind of lended itself to how good this film was. So this film was written and directed by Richard Linklater, at least in part. It was directed by him in full. But it's actually based on somewhat of a true story from his own life. In 1989, he was visiting his sister in New York City. He's from Austin, Texas, and he was there for one night. Oh, I'm sorry, not New York City, Philadelphia. I don't know why I said New York. But he was visiting his sister, and they were at a store, and he said that these are his own words from specific interviews, that he had been flirting with the cashier at a store, and so he wrote on a piece of paper, hey, do you want to go out later tonight, when his sister had work to do? And she said yes, and they explored the city of Philadelphia together for one night, because he left the next day. So it's a very similar idea to Before Sunrise, and that's where he got the idea from. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to him, the woman that he had spent time with actually passed away in 1994 or 1993, before the film had come out. So she never got to experience the film, but he didn't actually know that until later on, after Before Sunset was made. So Before Midnight is dedicated to her. But I think it's kind of beautiful, both the story, the dedication, and the fact that it was based on a true story. I think that's really wonderful and really lovely, and shows the power of human connection, which I really like. Talking some more about Before Sunrise, it was actually never intended initially to be in Europe. It was actually thought to potentially take place in Philadelphia or in Austin, Texas, where Richard Linklater is from. But after working on the script and financial budget things going on, they found that it was actually cheaper not to shoot in the United States as far as tax laws go, and that it would lend itself to the beauty of the script. So they ended up shooting in Vienna, and that's how that happened. Richard Linklater had always intended for one of the characters to be foreign. He didn't know from what country. He also didn't know which character. So it had gone through a lot of different casting processes. Some of the most interesting, though, is that Gwyneth Paltrow and Jennifer Aniston were both up for the role of Celine, or at the time, an unnamed female character. So that would have been a very different film, a very different route. Julie Delpy and Ethan Hawke, I think, both lend itself to the realism of the film and the charm of the film, and I could not see it be casted in any other way. The most fascinating thing about these films, by far, is they feel so natural, which a lot of times would be because of improv, and because the characters or the actors are getting to kind of do things that feel natural to them. But in fact, there is zero improv in these films. A lot of films even have some. There's none in these movies. They are completely scripted. And part of that is because there is an intense rehearsal process with all of these films, where Richard Linklater has the script, And Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy get to edit the script throughout the rehearsal process in ways that feel natural to them. And the script goes through many, many different passes until it is perfect and feels completely natural. And then it's rehearsed to hell. And then it just flows naturally with their cadence of dialogue. And that's how it works. So there is no improv, which is crazy. It's really cool. One of the reasons I appreciate Richard Linklater as a director is because he doesn't have the ego that says that his story has to be completely his. He really has this collaborative personality, which is something that I definitely relate to and I really enjoy as a part of filmmaking. So he works with the actors, and so in Before Sunrise, he actually had another female writer involved named Kimi Krizan, and he did that because he didn't want the story to be told from one perspective, particularly the male perspective in this sense. He wanted it to be a much more holistic, love story, and so he employed another female writer, a friend of his who helped write it with him, and then when Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy were attached, they also helped write this script. They are, unfortunately, though, not credited for writing this one, but then Kimi Krizan is not a part of Before Sunset or Before Midnight, but Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy both are, and they are credited as co-writers on those two films, and actually both won awards at the WGA for at least Before Sunset. Maybe both. It was up for Before Midnight was up for Best Adapted Screenplay at the 2013 Oscars. So it is definitely hailed as a writing achievement, and that is of credit to Krizan, Linklater, Delpy, and Hawke. So I just think it's so fascinating that these films are so heavily scripted because it feels so natural. These films were also never intended to maybe even become a trilogy. It was always supposed to be Before Sunrise, and then I had said in my Before Sunset review that they just felt compelled to write characters in their 30s, and even then they didn't intend for it to be a trilogy. If you look at that film, it works really well on its own, but it also works well in tandem with Before Sunrise, and then Before Midnight caps everything off really well. And both of the actors and Richard Linklater had said that they felt drawn to do another one to cap off the trilogy. So these felt like very natural ways to go. Were not cash grabs. In fact, they really didn't gross all that much money. Before Sunrise had a $2 million budget and grossed $5 million, which may seem like a lot of money. But as far as films go, with paying everybody back and paying the studio to break even, if you are a crew or a cast member, for just a film, you kind of have to make double your money. So they basically just broke even. And they had $2.5 million to do Before Sunrise, and then were given $2 million to do Before Sunset. So they actually had a much smaller budget, or not much, but a smaller budget for Before Sunset, which I think shows how this kind of wasn't a cash grab. It was just a natural way to tell the story. A few other kind of trivia moments is that the Before Sunrise starts off with an arguing couple and kind of in their 40s, and then the Before Trilogy, Before Midnight, kind of caps off with them becoming that arguing couple, which, despite my thoughts on that, is definitely a very holistic, thematic, beautiful sense to end the series, to end the trilogy. And then the final thing that I'll say that I think is definitely interesting to point out is that Ethan Hawke has described these films as Before Sunrise being what might be, Before Sunset being what could or should be, and Before Midnight being what is. So whether or not you agree with that statement, I do think it's definitely fascinating to think about and kind of beautiful. So I really, really adore this series. I think it is wonderful. It has definitely been my favorite watch in quarantine, or at least my favorite first watch in quarantine. So I highly recommend this series, particularly the first two, but the series definitely as a whole. There's speculation that they might have a fourth one. I think definitely when Before Midnight was made, they kind of said it works really well as a trilogy, but there has been kind of minor speculation that there might be one in 2022, but also with COVID and everything, that may not kind of pan out. And so be looking ahead to potentially before dawn, maybe before lunch. But look out because there might be another one. But if not, it's still a beautiful collection that I recommend to everybody. I love it. It's a beautiful romantic film. But that's the Before Trilogy. I hope that you liked this episode. I had a lot of fun doing this, talking about one series. I think it's kind of a cool, fun way to go. If you have any thoughts on it, any ideas for another series that you might want me to talk about in full, or if you liked or disliked this episode, please let me know. Tweet at us, GSMC_movies. We're looking at all of those, and we would love to interact with you guys and hear your thoughts. But that's the episode. I thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review because that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you. I have been your host, Casey Baum, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.